Magnum has said they're not going to sell.
They put out a press release saying that they are strengthening the social mission at the same time that they're attempting to get rid of the entire independent board of directors that is responsible for the social mission of the company. The company wanted to support the student protesters. Again, Magnum refused to allow that to happen. So clearly they've been Trumpified.
Yeah, so thank you, Ben, for being here in the Netherlands. It's an honor to have you here.
Thanks for the kind invitation. Thanks for how good you've been treating me the whole time. And this is great. Well, I'm happy. Thank you for introducing me to Utrecht. Yeah. You guys call it Utrecht, and we call it Utrecht?
Yeah, Utrecht.
Utrecht.
And the CHT, Trecht, that is a little bit difficult. Utrecht is a little difficult for you. And you have been in almost every Dutch newspaper this morning.
Amazing. We walked out of that office and there were 3 newspapers and I was in every one right across from my dear president.
No, and that is I think amazing. We missed the Telegraaf. The Telegraaf is the biggest Dutch newspaper. You're also in there. They said to me, you're on television, so that is all nice. But what I would like to do now, Ben, in this talk is to go a little bit back from, and then we end with Free Ben and Jerry's, what that is all about. But what I always like about business, because people in the Netherlands think, oh, there is Ben, and it must be the Ben from Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. So he built this big ice cream company, and which is now 1.2 billion or 3 in revenue. So how did that start? And so when you start a business, there's always coincidence.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us when you started, how that went. So you didn't start with a business plan and a vision on a global ice cream company. So how did it start? It didn't even start with ice cream, did it?
No. It started with Jerry and I meeting in 7th grade gym class. We were the 2 slowest, fattest kids in the class. And, and then we went through high school and Jerry went on to college, graduated pre-med and couldn't get into medical school. And I dropped out of a bunch of colleges, tried to make a living as a potter, and nobody would buy my pottery. So we found ourselves living together in, it was actually New York City, in the bad part of New York City. And I was a taxi cab driver and he was a lab technician, and we were saying we're failures in what we've been trying to do. And we came up with this idea, well, maybe we should start our own business.
But you were living then in New York, not in Burlington.
We were in the same apartment living in New York, yeah. And so we said, let's start a business. The only thing we were interested in doing was eating. And we thought we'd start a restaurant, and we talked to a friend of ours who knew something about business, and he said, if it's got to be food, whatever you do, don't start a full-service restaurant. There's so many problems with spoilage and staying open all these hours and hiring help. And if it has to be food, make it a very limited menu. And so our idea was to take a food trend that was starting off in the big cities and bring it to a rural college town, which is where we wanted to live. And the 2 food trends that were happening at the time were bagels and homemade ice cream. And originally we were planning on doing bagels, and then we found out how much bagel equipment cost and we couldn't afford it. So we figured ice cream had to be cheaper, and that's how we decided to start an ice cream business.
But did you pick out a town where you were going to set that up? Because you were leaving New York.
Correct. And, we figured, well, we're going to do ice cream. It should be a warm, rural college town. And so, this was before the age of personal computers. And so Jerry and I were sitting at a table, and he had the Guide to American Colleges in front of him, and I had the U.S. Almanac in front of me.
The weather.
Right. And he would, call out the names of towns, of college towns, and I would see what the temperature was in those towns.
That was your market research.
Yes. And we came up with the short list of warm rural college towns, and then we kind of checked out the ice cream situation in those warm rural college towns, and they already all had homemade ice cream shops. And so we didn't want to compete. So we threw out the criteria of warm and ended up in Burlington, Vermont, which is just south of Canada, a very cold place. But there was very little ice cream there. It's the only
but
state.
you didn't think, Ben, there was no ice cream because it was too cold.
Well, we had thrown out the criteria of warm.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So it didn't matter.
Right.
And then you had made a decision to do ice cream because the machinery, the second-hand machinery, I assume, was cheaper probably than the bagel machinery.
All we
equipment.
knew was that bagel equipment was too expensive.
Oh, okay.
And we assumed that ice cream equipment was cheaper. I mean, what do you need the problem with bagel equipment was that you needed this big rotary oven, and that's what we couldn't afford. And we figured, what do you need for ice cream? You need a ice cream maker. We were going to use we used a rock salt and ice cream maker, the old-fashioned kind. We had a 5-gallon one with a motor on it that we were operating in the window of the old gas station, and you need a freezer.
Yeah.
And that's it. And, actually, maybe a few weeks after we opened, we found out that if you're making ice cream, once it comes out of the rock salt and ice cream maker, it's still pretty soft. And in order to keep the ice cream creamy, you need to freeze it really quick. And so you need like a minus 20-degree freezer. And we got this ice cream dipping cabinet that went down to minus 20 degrees. But what we discovered was that when you pack it full of plus 20-degree ice cream, the temperature goes up. And so we needed to buy what's called an ice cream hardening cabinet that has extra refrigeration. And so that's some of what we learned.
And then you found a location, an empty gas station.
Not only was it empty, it was dilapidated. The roof had failed, and the insulation was coming out of the ceiling. The sheetrock had gotten all soggy and was kind of, falling off. There was ice on the floors. It was the wintertime.
But it was cheap.
It was cheap. It was in bad shape. My job was to repair the roof. We couldn't hire a roofer, and this was during the time that newspapers were printing on lithography. They were using aluminum plates.
Yes.
And they only used them once.
Yes.
And so, in the back of the newspaper, the Burlington Free Press, there was always this ad, aluminum sheets, 15 cents. And so we bought them out and had a shitload of aluminum sheets. And I was using them to patch the holes in the roof. And, some of the holes in the roof were really, really big. And I had to kind of like layer a bunch of them together, kind of like shingles. And then I used roofing tar to kind of fill in the cracks. And, that actually worked. We opened in May. It worked through that spring and through the summer and through the winter. And then when spring came around, with all the thawing and freezing, there was a lot of leaks. There was a lot of leaks in the ceiling, and So you put a garbage pail under one, you put another bucket under one, you get your big pot, you put it on the other one, but we had so many leaks that we didn't have enough things to catch the leaks.
Yeah.
And so we came up with this system where we bought these huge rolls of builder's plastic. It was like a 20-foot wide roll. And we attached it to the top of the walls right under the ceiling. And it would catch the water, and it kind of sloped some, so all the water collected in a kind of a little pond. And we poked a hole in the pond and attached a hose to it with silicone and ran it to the sink. And that's
how you did it.
got us through for a while.
Yeah, yeah. So it is amazing how those beginning stories end up to eventually a company that is doing more than $1 billion in ice cream.
It is very amazing. I mean, and there was no plan to be anything other than that one homemade ice cream shop, and one thing just led to another one. I mean, we were just taking a lot of small steps, mostly to survive.
Yeah, so you had no plan, and that is interesting for the nowadays entrepreneurs who, as you and I discussed, have plans, think we just go to a venture capitalist or whoever, or an angel investor, they give me money and I start. So in your case, you had no plan, you just wanted to survive. You made ice cream instead of bagels, and then it started to grow. How long did it take before did you ever have a plan? That's what I was. How long was it before you made the first plan?
Originally, we thought that we needed to get a loan from the bank. We were looking for a $26,000 loan, and we knew that we were bad risks for the bank. That we were young, we were new to the area, we weren't married, we had no business experience, we had no ice cream experience, we had no collateral. And so we knew that we had to get what was called an SBA guarantee. It's the Small Business Administration, and they guarantee loans to start up small businesses if you meet their criteria. So, and in order to meet their criteria,
you need a plan.
You need a really good business plan. And we had no idea what a business plan was. So we had this one friend who knew something about business, and we said, "What's a business plan?" And he gave us a copy of a business plan for a pizza place in New York City that was selling, pizza by the slice. And he said, "Well, there's the general format in this. Just use that as a template and come up with a plan." And, you had to talk about how many people were walking by your location and at different hours of the day, and what's your advertising plan gonna be, and what's your cost of goods sold, and what's your menu gonna be, and all that kind of stuff. And we're starting to work on this, and then we're realizing that what we're writing is pretty much the same as what this pizza parlor plan is. And so then we just decided to copy the pizza parlor plan, and wherever it said slice of pizza, we put in ice cream cone and submitted it to the SBA, and they approved it again.
Yeah.
But it was contingent on a suitable location. And this gas station, it was owned by the son of a greeting card company, Norcross Cards, and he was an architect. And he had this idea that he was going to tear down this gas station and build his dream building on the park there. And so we could only get a 1-year lease on the building, but the SBA wouldn't accept that because they needed a lease for at least the length of the loan. So we didn't get the loan.
Oh, you didn't?
No. And so we started with $4,000 a piece, and then the bank kicked in another $4,000. We didn't really leverage our our investment that well.
No. So you started with $12,000.
12,000. There you go.
$12,000 and no plan. And when did it grow into? When did it, in your opinion, became a little bit more serious? So when did you think it was serious?
Well, the first year, we sold as much ice cream as we could make. People really liked the ice cream. And we did more business than we predicted, but we just broke even. And we weren't paying ourselves
And
much.
how many flavors did you?
Well, the big ice cream chain at the time was Baskin-Robbins, 31 flavors. So we thought we should do them a little better. We came out with 34 flavors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, you start off with vanilla, chocolate, coffee, and strawberry, of course, and then you move on from there. The unusual flavors that we had at the beginning was Oreo mint, which became, after the business got more successful, we got a letter from Nabisco's lawyers who owned Oreo. And they said, we appreciate you using our products in your ice cream, but you may not pluralize our trademark.
You may not use.
In order to use it. You can call your ice cream mint with Oreo cookies, but it couldn't be called Oreo mint. And so we said, okay, we changed it. And went continued.
But that was a big hit, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the other unusual flavor at the time was Heath Bar Crunch. It was, Heath Bars are English toffee, chocolate-coated English toffee.
So it is, and you also told the story that you were the tester,
I
not
was
the taster.
Jerry was the ice cream maker, and I was the taste tester, but I have a very poor sense of taste. I have virtually no sense of smell, and so I don't taste things the way other people taste them. And so Jerry would make a sample of a flavor, give it to me, and say, "How do you like it?" I said, "It tastes really good, but I have no idea what flavor it is." And so, he added more flavoring and gave it to me again. And I said, I still can't tell what flavor it is. So then we ended up putting in, 2.5 times more flavoring than they recommended. And finally, I could figure out what flavor it was.
And that's why you became well known?
Highly flavored. The ice cream is a highly flavored ice cream. And it also, when you have a sensory deficit, your other senses kind of make up for it. So I have a very highly developed sense of mouth feel, texture.
So you feel
food texture.
The Oreo cookies
is very, very important. I mean, mostly when I eat food, I'm perceiving the texture. I'm not really perceiving the taste that much. And what I like in terms of ice cream, what makes ice cream interesting for me, for eating it, is the textural contrast between the creamy ice cream and the big crunchy chunks. So
for example, the Grayston bakeries you mentioned this morning, I know them very well. They make brownies.
Yeah.
And the Grayston Bakery brownies are in chunks in your brownie ice cream, isn't it?
Yeah, in the chocolate fudge brownie ice cream. I mean, it's interesting how that came to be. At this first organizing meeting for what became the Social Ventures Network, I was there at that meeting, and at that time, Ben & Jerry's was just in the process of opening up a manufacturing plant to make brownie ice cream sandwiches. And it used these thin, chewy, fudgy brownies, which were very unusual and very good as a ice cream sandwich. But the only supplier for that was this very small supplier in Massachusetts. And we were concerned that we were opening up this whole plant that was dependent on this very small supplier. And if something went wrong, we'd be screwed. So we were looking for a secondary supplier, and I'm at this organizing conference for what became Social Ventures Network, and I met this Jewish Buddhist nuclear physicist monk called Bernie Glassman. And we're walking around the lake, and he says, yeah, I've started this bakery, for the purpose of employing formerly unemployable people like drug addicts and ex-convicts and formerly homeless people. And I said, wow, you're doing a bakery? I said, yeah. Then, well, we're looking for a bakery. We need a bakery that'll make chewy, fudgy brownies, thin, chewy, fudgy brownies. That's just like the ones that this other bakery's making, so we can have two suppliers. And he said, sure, I can do that. And, so we went through a lot of R&D, a lot of back and forth, and he, finally came up with a brownie that we thought was good and said, and we said, well, we'll order half a truckload to start. That's 10,000 pounds. And can you do that? He said, yeah, sure, I can do that. It'll take me a few weeks to make that amount. And so, eventually the half a truck shows up, and it's in these, like 25-pound boxes. And, so that they're frozen, and we bring them out onto the line. They're making the chocolate brownies sandwiches. They open up this box, and they go to pull them out, and they're all stuck together. It's like one 25-pound block of brownie. And what happened was a similar thing, that he was putting these hot brownies into his storage freezer, and, the temperature in the storage freezer went way up, and they all stuck together. So, the people that were working there were pissed. How are we supposed to do it with this stuff? And they're trying to peel them apart, and most of them broke. And, if it was a normal supplier, we just would have shipped it back and told them to eat it. Yeah. But that would put this company out of business, and we were trying to support them. So what we ended up doing was we ended up using little pieces and put it in chocolate fudge brownie ice cream, and that's how that flavor was created.
Invented, yeah. That again, Ben, that is shows coincidence a little bit, because
coincidence or synchronicity.
Yeah, yeah. So that is how that came about, and before we go to your current challenge, the company was not a normal company. Yeah? So you now talked about the beginning of the company, but the company was different, a little bit more idiotic from other companies, because you thought, and I think, that a company is part of society. So you have to be conscious of society and play a societal role. So maybe you can tell a little bit about how that came about, probably because you and Jerry are like that. And but why are not all the other companies like that? Well,
I think that a lot of people who start businesses, it's different now since Ben & Jerry's proved.
Be careful that you don't touch this. Yeah.
It's different now since Ben & Jerry's proved that you can have a business that makes money and repairs problems in the society at the same time.
Yeah.
And now, but at the time, what the business world was telling the public was that Oh no, we can't take care of that problem or this problem or whatever problem, because then we'll go out of business. We can't make a profit and try to solve social problems at the same time. Uh, and I think that people who went into business, people who started businesses, believed that. And I think that the so the people who started businesses didn't have any. They weren't the kind of people who had any interest in addressing social problems. People who had an interest in addressing social problems went into the nonprofit sector, or they went into professions, the helping professions. And
But
so
but Ben, I personally think that that is kind of, it sounds logical, but in my opinion, it's also kind of illogical.
well, you should express your opinions.
Yeah, because I think that if you want to have employees, if you have employees in a company who are feeling well treated, well paid, in the right circumstances, they perform better, the products are better, their colleagues maybe stay longer. So that whole improvement of the company by treating your people, maybe their families, maybe their environment of the factory, is creating a better, more profitable, if you do it well, company. So,
Yeah,
so
I
that is
think-
why I think it is not so illogical to, and that is why I think if you say, well, I don't have to take care of my people, I pay myself 400 times more than my employees, and they don't care. If you think that they don't care, but they do care, of course, then it is not such a smart business mentality. So I think, don't you think it is? It's almost a better business mentality to care.
I think you're right. I think that there's all these business studies talking about the high cost of employee turnover.
Yeah.
That when you factor in the loss that your company is having when you lose an employee, the expense that you go through in order to recruit a new employee, orienting the new employee, interviewing the new employee, training the new employee, uh, and that you've lost the experience that that the guy who left had. It's a huge cost to the business, and also, so a socially conscious business does a much better. It's easier to recruit employees because they want to work for a business that has some purpose that's greater than maximizing profits for the man.
Yeah, because Ben, when I started my first company, I never forget. I just came out of business school. I never forget this example that somebody said. He said, "I'm going to make an investment of $1 million." I said, "Wow, you're going to make an investment of $1 million?" He said, "I'm going to hire an employee." He said, and I said, "What does that million have to do with an employee?" At that time, in the 80s of the last century, it was a lot of lifetime employment for people.
Yes.
So if you add it all up, if you employ somebody for 30 or 40 years, it is an investment you make into a person for $1 million for
Very
your company.
interesting. Yeah.
So
There's a guy who really understood it.
yeah, and if you would say, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to make an investment of $1 million, you better treat that million well.
Yeah.
And that is, but if you just say, oh, I'm just employing an employee and I don't care and I don't pay him well and I hope he works hard or she, and that is, so I've always seen that as a very stupid way of doing business, because it is clear that if you have a company that serves community instead of a company producing cigarettes. I always tell people when you're at a birthday party and you ask, what do you do? Well, we produce cigarettes. Why? Yeah, it kills people. That's why. The more people we kill, the more cigarettes we produce. Or the other way around. The more cigarettes we produce, the more people we kill. And we are happy with that. So how can you be happy with that? So it is, and nowadays, if you're at a birthday party, if you work for a cigarette company, you probably don't tell. And when you work for a bank, you don't tell. And that is, so Ben and Jerry's became an example of a combination, I'm trying to figure that out, of a social enterprise, actually a normal enterprise with a social feeling, maybe not even a social mission, a social consciousness.
I think it's well, I mean, the difference is that most businesses only have one mission, which is to maximize profits.
Yes.
And, for public companies, it's to maximize short-term profits.
Yeah.
And so at Ben & Jerry's, we ended up developing a 3-part mission statement, that we have a social mission, we have a financial mission, and we have a product mission. And, this was before, the triple bottom line and before ESG and all that kind of stuff. And, there was a lot of discussion about it. I mean, we came up with that social mission because there was a lot of conflict about a product that we were coming out with, which was a chocolate-covered ice cream bar on a stick. And, at the time, I was thinking about what are the tools, what are the potential tools that a business has to improve the quality of life. And we concluded, Jerry and I, that the most powerful tool that a business has is its voice. And we then started thinking that we can use our packaging as media and discuss social issues or communicate social issues on our packaging. And so, normally you'd be coming out with this chocolate-covered ice cream pop on a stick, and the copy on the package would say, "You're about to eat the most luxurious, amazing thing you ever tasted." And instead, this was during the days of the Cold War, when, the U.S. was spending gobs of money, this arms race, with the Soviet Union. And so we decided, well, what I wanted to do was to call this product a peace pop and to use the packaging to advocate for spending 1% of the Department of Defense budget on peace through understanding activities between the people of the U.S. and the people of the Soviet Union. And there were managers at the company that were outraged about that we shouldn't do that business has no place in taking a stand on.
Managers in Ben & Jerry's?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And and also there were some people on the board of directors who felt the same way, that this is not what business does. That, they kept on saying, well, we can only discuss stuff that has a business nexus. What's the relationship of the Cold War to our ice cream business? And there wasn't one really. So, a conflict raged, and it was kind of not being resolved. And finally, at the board of directors, they said, well, if it's part of the mission of the company, then it's okay. And so then that's when we wrote that 3-part mission statement that has the social mission. And then there were all these arguments about, well, when we write the mission down, which one should come first? Which one has priority over the others? And the resolution was that they were all co-equal and they were interdependent. And it was such a strong statement that we wrote the mission statement horizontally, that they're all on the same level. And so that's what we did.
And the peace pop.
The peace pop.
Did it happen?
It did. It came out. I mean, what people were saying was that, oh, geez, if we have the Peace Pop in the supermarkets, right-wing groups that are in favor of big defense budgets, they're gonna picket the supermarkets, and the supermarket's gonna pull the product off the shelf, and then the people that are making the stuff will lose their jobs, and none of that happened. I mean, what ended up happening actually was that there was some, a decent amount of press coverage saying, wow, here's this ice cream company that's calling for peace through understanding activities on their packaging, because it was news, because companies didn't do that.
No. So that is. I think that is interesting, Ben, that you did all that stuff, and it's also kind of amazing that you did it. And there were, of course, some other companies who did that, but not very many in those days. So let's make one step forward. The company started to grow and move into the US out of Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
And when was that? When was that also the moment that you started to raise money in Vermont? Because you, at a certain point in time, you said you started to raise money in Vermont.
Right. That the company was at a level of about $3 million, and we were making ice cream in kind of a makeshift facility with World War II era ice cream making equipment, and we didn't have enough room to store our raw ingredients. We didn't have enough room to store our finished product. Working conditions were not good, and it was the stage in a business's life when it needs a cash infusion in order to go to the next level, which for us was building a real ice cream plant. And but we needed to raise the money to do it. And we had unsolicited, there were a bunch of venture capitalists that were coming to us, and we looked at that as, well, that's essentially a bunch of pretty well-to-do people who would like to become more well-to-do. And what we wanted to do was to spread the wealth. We wanted to find a way for the community to become the owners of the business. And, we didn't...
Which was also a new idea.
Yeah.
To bring
right, I think so. I mean, what ended up happening was that we had an in-state Vermont public stock offering, which was the first time it was ever done in Vermont. It was a little-known section of the law that nobody had ever used before, and we ended up, so we advertised the stock in the first section of the newspaper with the clothing ads and the supermarket ads saying, get a scoop of the action, and it was a very low minimum buy of $126, and that would enable someone to essentially get in on the ground floor, an opportunity that's usually only available to sophisticated investors that have, a fair amount of money to invest. And the accountants and the lawyers are telling us, this is stupid, this is crazy, it's never been done before, it's not going to work. There's not enough people in Vermont, they don't have enough money, and we said, we don't care. If we can't finance it this way, then we don't really want to grow the business. And
so how much did you raise?
We did it. We raised $750,000, and 1 out of every 100 Vermont families became an owner in Ben & Jerry's.
And are they still owners, or most of them, you think?
We would have these shareholders meetings, these annual meetings, which were celebrations. They were, we had music festivals as part of it. Most companies, public companies, are trying to hold their annual meeting at an inconvenient time and an inconvenient place.
But nobody to show up.
Right. They didn't want people to show up. We wanted everyone to show up, and we held it on a weekend, and there was a big festive tent outside the plant. And and it was a party, and lots of people came, and so at those shareholders meetings, there's a question and answer period at the time, and there'd be usually one guy who would raise his hand and say, "Hey, man, I love owning stock in this company. It's a great company, but I did invest money here. How am I supposed to get a return on my money? There's no market for the stock." And then some other shareholder would stand up and say, "Just owning stock in this company is benefit enough." But people were making an investment, and we needed to find a way for them to be able to get a return on their investment. So a few years later, we had a need for more cash, and we ended up going public nationally. We were listed on NASDAQ, and so.
And what year was that then?
Who can remember? I think it was
the 90s.
Maybe it was the late 80s or the 90s.
So then you had a company with thousands of shareholders, probably.
Yeah.
And if you say 1 out of 100, thousands of shareholders that were very involved, very socially oriented, and listed at NASDAQ. And then all of a sudden, people wanted to buy the company.
Well, what happened was that we hired the wrong CEO. He saw a way for himself to make a bunch of money by putting the company up for sale. And he contacted Unilever, kind of surreptitiously and suggested, "Why don't you make an offer for the company?" And they did.
But there was no way for you and Jerry to be able to stop that, or?
Well, when we
fired the CEO.
Well, it was too late. When we went public, we were aware that there was a possibility that there'd be a takeover, and so the lawyers put together what they called poison pills.
Yes.
That would prevent a takeover like that, and so when this offer came in from Unilever, the board of directors is, nobody wanted to sell the company, and the board of the lawyers the CEO had a lawyer, and his lawyer was saying, "You got to sell the company," and so then then the rest of the board had a lawyer. There was a lot of lawyers. And it turned out that the poison pill was that we had what they call super shares. So the insiders, the people that had been with the company for a long time, Jerry and myself and a bunch of others, they had shares that had 10 votes, and whereas everybody else had shares that only had 1 vote. So the super shares kind of controlled the company, and so the CEO ends up pointing out that, hey, there's this fine print in the super shares that says that the super shares can be rescinded by a majority vote of the board, and then. The CEO's lawyer, comes in and says, and the fiduciary responsibility of the board, since there's an offer for far in excess of what the stock is trading at, is that you have to rescind the super shares. And, the lawyers are going back and forth. Well, we don't think you're going to get sued, but, a bunch of the board members are concerned that, they definitely don't want to get sued. And we're talking about liability and all that crap, and in the end, the board voted to recommend the sale because they felt forced into it by SEC rules.
But you and Jerry, and I think that is important, didn't wanted. And is that the reason why you introduced or maybe invented this independent board? So, or did Unilever come up with that, or did you?
Well, Jerry and I were very opposed to the sale.
Yeah.
You know, I would say myself especially. And the reason we were opposed was because we felt that if a company that does not have a similar social mission becomes the owner of the company, then Ben and Jerry's social mission would die. And you know, when these negotiations started happening, the way the legal and financial community describes it is that the company is now in play, which means that anyone can go and make an offer for it. And so there were several other companies that were making an offer, and Unilever really wanted it because their arch competitor in the global ice cream field, Nestle, had just bought Haagen-Dazs. And so Unilever felt they needed a super premium ice cream to compete, and that was us. So Unilever wanted to make their offer the one that we accepted. And they came to realize that the issue was the social mission.
Yeah.
And so we tried to write the social mission into the contract, into the purchase and sale agreement, and realized that, you know, the social mission needs to change and evolve over time. It needs to respond to what's going on in the society and the world. And the way we figured out to do it was to form an unprecedented governance structure for Ben & Jerry's, that it was going to be a wholly owned independent subsidiary that had its own board of directors. And it's an independent board of directors. That's people who, originally it was the people who used to be on the Ben & Jerry's board when it was independent.
Yeah, but it was independent of Unilever.
Independent of Unilever. That's what it meant.
Yeah.
And that board had legal authority over the social mission, the quality of the ice cream, the use of the trademark, and Unilever had legal authority over the operations and the finances.
And that worked well.
Yeah, it really worked for a period of 20 years. I mean, I thought it was not going to work, but you know, Unilever respected the agreement, and the social mission thrived.
Yeah,
for those 20 years.
It had some painful and difficult moments and ups and downs, I assume. It didn't always go
right. They were always, every once in a while, conflicts, but they weren't major things until you know, after like 2 years of study and visits to the area and research, both Unilever and Ben & Jerry's management and the independent board agreed that Ben & Jerry's should pull out of the occupied territories in the West Bank because it was antithetical to the values of Ben & Jerry's. That, you know, these guys were second-class citizens being mistreated and illegal occupation, all that kind of stuff. And
but Unilever also agreed that Ben & Jerry's should pull back.
Yeah. I mean, they agreed that it should pull back based on the values of Ben & Jerry's and the authority of the independent board of directors. And but they agreed. They were on board. And as soon as the company announced they were pulling out, what I'm told is that the head of Israel called up the head of Unilever and said, hey, if you don't make this right, if you don't get this ice cream back in the West Bank, we're going to kick out all the Unilever businesses from Israel. And Unilever had a lot of businesses there. And they, without consulting with the board, they agreed to sell the rights to Ben & Jerry's to an Israeli so that Ben & Jerry's would still be available there in the West Bank. And, that was, a violation of the legal authority of the board. And there was a negotiation, and, eventually that did not succeed. And the board had no other choice but to sue Unilever, and things kind of went downhill from there.
Yeah. And that was in 2021 or 22,
Correct.
Something like that. Yeah. So that is, I think we have now spoken, Ben, a lot about the importance of the social mission in the early days to you and Jerry, then of course to the people who started to work for you, then to the people of Vermont who also liked it and became shareholders. So I would dare to say, and I think you agree with that it is, I always call it intrinsically driven. Extrinsically is that there is a law, you cannot do that, and you don't do that. Intrinsically is you feel that it has to, it's values. I think a value system. Intrinsically, you feel that something is right and you feel that something is wrong. I'm not going to work for a cigarette company because I think if I produce cigarettes, people are going to smoke and they're going to be killed. So, and I cannot say, well, those people buy the cigarettes themselves, so they do it themselves. What Shell does with the gasoline, we don't harm anybody. The people who buy the gasoline for their cars do it themselves.
Right.
Also, the weapons industry, when your daughter turns 15, you give her an AR-15 as a birthday present. And now, if she kills somebody, well, it's her business, but it's not us. So then Unilever, with, let's say, in some painful situation at a certain point in time, I'm trying to understand, or decided to sell the ice cream company. So,
well, after that, it was.
or did something else happen after that?
I think Unilever, starting around 2 years ago, made a decision that they were going to, as they say, demerge their entire ice cream division. About 100 brands all around the world, about a $12 billion business. And, when
was there a reason for that, Ben? Did they like?
I think what they announced was that, the company could be more focused, that, the frozen distribution chain did not mesh well into their other stuff. And I think that, and it's clear now because they just divested a whole other part. I mean, essentially,
Food.
They've pretty much got out of the whole food business because they were also in health and beauty aids, and there's a lot more profit in health and beauty aids, and that's what companies are about, most of them. So why did they demerge? I mean, I think mostly for financial reasons. And but when they announced that, Jerry and I went to them and said,
to Unilever, right? That was
Unilever, right? Thank you. When they announced that, Jerry and I went to them and said, hey, as long as you're getting rid of all your ice cream businesses, why don't you just carve out Ben & Jerry's and sell it separate so that we can get it owned by some socially conscious investors that actually agree with the social mission, and that'll solve all these conflicts that we've been having with you guys. And they refused to do that, and but Jerry and I were very public about calling for socially conscious investors to make an offer to Unilever, because we thought, well, maybe if there's an offer on the table,
they say yes.
Yeah. And those investors appeared, and some of them made an offer. Unilever just refused to engage with them, and so we have those investors, and now it's been spun off into the Magnum company, and as soon as it was spun off into the Magnum Corporation fired the existing CEO, who was a 30-year Ben & Jerry's employee, because he was listening to the independent board. He knew that it's a legally binding contract. He's supposed to take direction from the independent board, and Unilever says, don't listen to those guys, or Magnum says, don't listen to those guys. And he got fired, and then they proceeded to dismantle the entire independent board. They don't have the legal authority to do that, but that's what they announced they were doing. And the fact of the matter is that they're refusing to meet with the independent board, so they're not seeking the approvals they're supposed to from the independent board. So essentially, the independent board is in exile. It kind of
does it still exist, Ben? The independent board, is it still there today?
Well, the people exist, and I think they do meet. Together, but they're not meeting with the management, so they're not really able to. I mean, I think the company is being run illegally.
Does it still exist? And you said it physically, the people exist.
The people are still on this earth, and I do believe they meet together, but
nobody listens.
Magnum says they don't exist, and Magnum doesn't allow its management to have any communications.
So your conclusion is that then that Magnum or the current Ben & Jerry's management does not value the social mission?
Well, the CEO, who is a former Unilever ice cream division, now Magnum employee, does not value the independent board, and does not, is not abiding by a legally binding contract.
Yeah. So the solution could be, it's not a solution, I think, but the solution could be that they say, well, we now reinstate or reinstall the independent board, and we're going to listen to everything they say, because it was already a little bit becoming an issue, that whole independent board. So because otherwise you and Jerry 2 years ago, 3 years ago would not have said, well, let's take it out.
That's right. I mean, if they were abiding by the contract, there would be no Free Ben & Jerry's campaign.
No.
This is only happening because they're violating the basic values of the company, the legal governance structure that was set up.
Yeah, but that already also is, if you start to think, and I hope you agree with what I'm now going to say, if you think that legal constructions are forcing people to move into a social direction, then you're far ahead already. Yeah? Then you're far down the
right. It's never going to work.
No, that's what
clearly
I mean.
They don't want to abide by the contract.
No, because
clearly,
they want to sell as much ice cream as possible, which is from a public company perspective, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the other brands, they actually own 99 other brands. If you look at the other brands that they own, those are all in keeping with their values. Those brands are valueless. They don't have social missions. And I mean,
There are brands like Cornetto and other brands.
Cornetto, Klondike, and their other big brand is Magnum bars. And as you know, I was just at the Magnum corporate offices yesterday, I think it was, and they've got all these video screens that are playing Magnum ads for their Magnum bars, and it is mostly beautiful, provocative women doing beautiful, provocative things with Magnum bars, and it's a pretty different head from, I mean, their slogan is ice cream makes life better. Ben and Jerry's slogan is justice in all its flavors. It's really two very, very different things.
Yeah, so that do not go well together. So you can, and if you have to enforce that justice with a legal construction,
it's never going to work. I mean, you're working against each other.
Yeah. So that is why, in your opinion, I think it is logical that you started a campaign which everybody can see on the internet. It's called
FreeBenandJerrys.com.
Yeah.
FreeBenandJerrys.com.
Yeah. So can you say it again?
FreeBenandJerrys.com.
But what people don't understand, or people sometimes misinterpret, is that they say, but first Ben sold Ben and Jerry's to Unilever, Ben and Jerry's sold Ben and Jerry's to Unilever, and now they want to buy it back.
That's right.
And but both are not true.
That's correct. I opposed the sale, as with all the energy I had, because for the same reason.
Yeah.
To maintain the social mission, and now I'm working to free Ben and Jerry's with all the energy that I have, for the same reason, to maintain the social mission. And it's not like I'm trying to buy back the company. I just want to see it owned by socially conscious investors who agree with the mission. And so I'm not really planning on being an investor in the company. If it turns out that they want me to be, I'll do it. But
you're one of the investors maybe. But what I'm wondering, Ben, suppose that succeeds. Huh?
Yeah.
Suppose you succeed, you find a social conscious investor, as you say, and a Magnum sells. Then are you not afraid then that new investor also eventually maybe care so much about return that there's still a pressure on that social mission? What I want to ask is the company maybe not already, it's too big to be care? Well, it sounds ridiculous when I say it, actually. Too big to care about the social mission, because I think every company should care about the social mission, because it's normal, a part of society. But anyway, how do you look at that? Do you see a danger, or can you imagine that there is a company that does not even need a independent board? So suppose you have Ben and Jerry's, you have the right investors, you don't need an independent board, you just have a board. And that board is doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So you don't need an independent board.
It's possible. We're currently talking about what would be the governance structure going forward. And, since, it was in the year 2000 that this, that the governance structure that we currently have was developed. And, the movement toward socially conscious businesses and businesses that have a perpetual purpose has expanded. And so there are new structures that have been developed. There's some companies that have what they call a perpetual purpose trust. I'm not sure exactly how that works. There's some companies that have a nonprofit that is the holder of shares that have a lot of control over the company. Examples of companies that have stuff like that are Patagonia, I think Carlsbad Beer, and Novo Nordisk, and there's a few others. I don't know. I just
But
talked-
those three are already very well-known brands. Huh?
yeah.
Novo Nordisk.
I think Mozilla is a company. I think they're a benefits company that also has a structure,
Yeah.
kind of like that. That's designed to have what the lawyer calls mission lock.
Yeah.
And
Michelle.
and some of the structures she's talking about have a sentinel, and she was saying that the problem with the governance structure that we had come up with in 2000 was that it didn't have an enforcement mechanism that outside of suing in a court of law, and it's kind of a shitty enforcement mechanism.
Yeah. But there must be many lawsuits be ongoing at this moment in time.
Yeah, right now, I mean, if you look at what Magnum has done to Ben & Jerry's, they've ended up in a lawsuit with the independent board. They've ended up in a lawsuit with the Ben & Jerry's Foundation because they've refused to continue to fund it. One of the co-founders resigned in protest. The other co-founder is here, trying to free Ben & Jerry's. And in the process, they defamed Anarata, the chair of the Ben & Jerry's Foundation, and she's now suing them for defamation. So
it's a whole legal.
It's a morass, and when you think about it, I mean, could all these people be wrong? Me, Jerry, the independent board, the foundation. I don't think so. I mean, and the other thing is, think about their motivations. The independent board has nothing personally to gain. The foundation has nothing personally to gain.
A little bit about the foundation, Ben. The foundation was set up to receive 7.5% of the profits?
Of pre-tax profits. That's the way it was when the company was independent. And then when it became owned by Unilever, they weren't going to report the profits separately. So there was a conversion done that related to number of gallons sold. So it's essentially the same, comes out to be the same number.
Yeah. So the pre-tax profit, which is quite an amount.
Of an unusually high amount for a publicly held company. I think that there might be, now I heard about, I think one company that's doing 10%.
Yeah, that's Rituals. You
yes,
meet with them
that's
tomorrow.
Correct, right.
And Rituals is doing, I don't know if it's pre or after tax, because that also can make a difference. But they do 10%.
Yeah.
They call it the 10% profit pledge, which is kind of cool
Which
as well.
is, it's great.
And that is, they're not publicly held, I think, Rituals now. They're a B Corp, like Ben & Jerry's. And so, but you can also say 10% is not high, but why not 50%? And that is, but don't say that to a publicly held company, because then the shareholder. Don't you think that that 7.5%, is that gone now? Is there?
No, I think once we're able to free Ben & Jerry's, I think the 7.5% will be right back there.
But
Right now, Magnum is refusing to fund the foundation.
So the foundation basically has...
They have enough money to get through this year, this calendar year.
And then they have to be refunded. So it is... so the way forward is either one long legal battle, or parties at a certain point in time realize that they have different objectives
Right.
that
That's
don't
exactly
match.
right. I mean, it's time for an amicable divorce.
Yeah,
Uh, you know, they have irreconcilable differences.
yeah. So a divorce, but you need two people. So how do you see, Ben? Are you hopeful?
Yes, I am hugely hopeful. I mean, I'm putting everything I've got into it. You got to be hopeful if you're doing that. Um,
But this morning, Ben, there was this guy in the audience who worked for, or used to work for Ben and Jerry's at Unilever, and he said that there were a lot of employees that were demotivated by by everything that was going on. So there must have been quite a group of employees that worked there because they liked the social mission, and they are demotivated now. They are, yeah.
yeah, I think that is really true.
So, but also there are also people who don't care and who just want to sell as much ice cream as possible, and
That's also true, and that's it's also okay, except you need to abide by a legally binding contract.
yeah, yeah. So that is so. What are your expectations for the coming years, Ben? How long do you think this will last?
I really don't know how long it's gonna take, but I'm committed to doing everything I can to free Ben and Jerry's, and I, we're certainly making more and more progress. More and more socially conscious investors are getting involved and talking with their people about divesting from the stock, or getting in touch with the Magnum Corporation and telling them that they're doing the wrong thing, trying to influence them in some way. Uh, there's more and more coverage in the financial press. I think right now, Patagonia and Dr. Bronner's are in the process of writing an op-ed about this. So we're building more and more opposition, and the reality is that I can't save Ben and Jerry's on my own, but the fate of Ben and Jerry's is in the hands of the public.
Yeah.
If people decide to make their voice heard, to stand up, to visit, say, freebenandjerrys.com, if they get these really nice stickers that we have and go out and sticker Magnum products in the supermarket, that has a big effect. I mean, we had been talking about suggesting that to our supporters, and hadn't gotten around to it yet. I mean, there's a whole series of activities that we have up our sleeves. And,
Yeah, you have short sleeves now, eh?
but for the first time, I went into an Albert Heijn and started stickering Magnum products, and it's fun, it's easy. I mean, you feel like you're doing something
Illegal.
so, who knows? Maybe it is. I don't know.
Well, I think it is, but but maybe it's fun.
Prosecute people for stickering Magnum pints. That would be great.
Yeah, that's the.
The other thing I ran into is Magnum has expanded from just chocolate covered bars to pints of ice cream. And I was looking at Albert Heijn, and they have one of these things that's called like billionaire caramel something or other, which, is an indication of, kind of where they're at.
Yeah, but the final question, Ben, you don't believe that? Suppose that Magnum says, you know what, or Ben and Jerry's, we reinstall and fully respect an independent board, and we listen to what they have to say, and we go forward from there. Do you believe that
Well, I mean, that's the problem, is that it's impossible for the Magnum company to install an independent board. The act of them installing the board means that it's not independent. So, yeah, I mean that is their plan. They would like to appoint a so-called independent
board.
chair,
Yeah.
and then work with that chair to appoint more members.
Because I can imagine, Ben, that that it could even help them if they say we have the pure ice cream brands, and then we have this very socially oriented, great brand. Because you and I think like that. Eh? I think there are business people who think like that. That it could be very valuable to have that for people who really like that. And that is. But then again, you say that is not possible to appoint an independent board, because then it's not independent. Well, I think that I understand that is going to be difficult. So, well, I think this is it has solved a lot of questions that people have about how the company started. No plan, Ben, and it became a great company. You are intrinsically, you and Jerry, driven, and many of the people I think who work there, to have a social mission, and you want to save that social mission. And I wish you good luck with that.
Thank you. Well, we can use all the help we can get, and hopefully you'll become one of our prime sticker distributors here in the Netherlands.
Yeah, the stickers are all gone, are they?
That's right. I'll get you a whole new batch, and you just need to distribute it to your 20,000 podcast listeners. Yeah, all you listeners, send an email to Lean, say you want stickers, and
you will provide the stickers.
I will provide the stickers to you, Lean, but you are the master distributor. you can have a lot of power here.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ben, for this, and thank you for being here. Thank you for opening the event tomorrow, and yeah, it's great.
I'm looking forward to it. It's been great spending time with you, Lean. Thank you.
Thank you.